Hello, my name is Simon Swift and I'm a lecturer in critical and cultural theory at the University of Leeds. And I also lecture on a very large module for first year students who've just arrived at this university, where we think about different forms of prose writing, different forms of prose texts. Among them, Great Expectations by Charles Dickens, which is the text I'm going to talk to you about today. And the topic of this podcast is reading against the grain. Are traditional texts always what they seem? As I say, I'm going to think about Great Expectations in that context. I'm going to be reading it alongside of a set of other texts by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, and in particular their Communist Manifesto from 1848. Now, I want to begin this podcast by encouraging you to sort of bracket any assumptions that you might have about Marx and Engels. You may not think about them very much at all, but it may be that you've got particular ideas about them in your minds. And I want you to just set any assumptions, any preconceptions you might have about them to one side for the course of this podcast. In a similar way, Charles Dickens' Great Expectations is a classic, canonical, 19th century realist novel, which is about class, identity, money, social change. We may have lots of assumptions about what it means to be that kind of text, what it means to be a big, realist 19th century novel. And I'd ask you to set those kinds of assumptions aside also. Any preconceptions you have about Dickens, any thoughts that you might have about him, put them to one side, bracket them for a moment, and just open yourselves up to the suggestions I'm going to make in the course of this podcast about a reading of Dickens alongside of Marx and Engels. So, as I've said, Dickens' novel is clearly concerned with issues around class, identity, money, social change, the relationship between the country and the city. And it's also a novel which is interested, I think, in the Industrial Revolution and the effect of the Industrial Revolution on English society. It's a novel which is set before the Industrial Revolution, however. How do we know this? How do we know that Great Expectations is set before the Industrial Revolution? In order to answer this question, we need to think for a moment about the idea of narrative voice in this novel, about the voice of the narrator. We find out pretty early on in the novel that the events narrated take place before the Industrial Revolution, before the machine age. We're told, for example, that the scene with which the novel opens, the scene in the graveyard in which Pip is looking at his parents' tombstones, takes place before the invention of the camera. So I'm just going to read out a passage to you from the very beginning of Great Expectations, where Pip is in the graveyard, on the marshes, looking at his parents' gravestones. I give Pirrip as my father's family name on the authority of his tombstone, and my sister, Mrs. Joe Gargery, who married the blacksmith. As I never saw my father or my mother, and never saw any likeness of either of them, for their days were long before the days of photographs, my first fancies regarding what they were like were unreasonably derived from their tombstones. The shape of the letters on my father's gave me an odd idea that he was a square, stout, dark man with curly black hair. So notice, first of all, that this is a scene of reading, that Pip, who is an illiterate rural boy, is reading his parents' tombstones. He's reading the writing on his parents' tombstones. And since he can't read these letters, since he's illiterate, he tries to decipher something of what his parents were like, something of what they looked like, from the shape of the letters on the tombstones. So he's looking at the shape of the letters and trying to imagine what his parents might have looked like based on those shapes. And notice too that he compares those letters to photographs, even though he's also telling us that the world of his childhood was long before the invention of the photograph, the invention of photography. We find out also that the events of Pip's childhood take place before the development of the railways. So the point I'm making here really is that the narrative of Great Expectations begins before the machine age, but it makes us think about machines. It tells us that this was a time before machines were invented. So the time of Great Expectations is prior to the Industrial Revolution. But the time in which the story is told is after the Industrial Revolution. There are, in fact, two Pips. Pip the protagonist, the small boy growing up, and Pip the narrator, looking back at himself as a young child. And between those two Pips, dividing them in some ways, there is the Industrial Revolution, the machine age. But before going on to think a bit more about this idea of the Industrial Revolution and its importance for Dickens's narrative, I just want to underline the fact that this novel begins with a scene of reading. The first thing that happens in this novel is that a character reads, or in fact, he misreads, because of course Pip is illiterate. He can't read the letters on his parents' gravestones. He's trying to, but he can't read them. So it's not just a scene of reading this scene on the marshes, but it's also a scene of misreading. Pip is almost looking at these letters as photographs, or almost as kinds of pictures. He's imagining them as pictures of his parents, almost as if he's looking at them as if they were a kind of, as if they were hieroglyphics, as if they were an ancient Egyptian language that he can't read, a form of picture writing. And of course, it's interesting to think about the fact that the whole novel, the whole of Great Expectations, is about reading and about the dangers of misreading. In a sense, the whole novel is condensed or plays out in miniature form in this little scene in the graveyard on the marshes. Pip spends the whole narrative reading and misreading signs around him, making inferences about who his benefactor is, for example, and misconstruing what's going on around him. So Pip is a kind of a reader, and in some ways, he's quite a bad reader. So it seems almost obvious to say that a big, realist 19th century novel like Great Expectations is preoccupied with issues of class and identity and money and education and social change. And I've almost described Pip as a kind of, in some ways, a kind of representative figure of 19th century England. He moves from being this rural, illiterate child to this narrator figure, to this writer, not only a reader, but a writer. He becomes educated. He tries to become a gentleman. He changes his class position. He moves to the city. And in this way, he's very typical of the experience of 19th century people. That's a very broad claim to make, and I'm not suggesting for a moment that most rural illiterate boys managed to become gentlemen in the way of Pip. Clearly there's an element of fairy tale or fantasy about his story. But in a very kind of heightened and magical way, he's also representing the experience of many people in the 19th century who are moving from the countryside to the city, becoming urbanized, changing their class position. So already we're starting to kind of problematize this notion of a realist novel in the 19th century. It's not just the case that a novel like Great Expectations is about class, is about social change, is about money. It's also a novel about something as complicated and magical and miraculous as reading and the reading of signs. And it also has the structure of a fairy tale in some ways. a kind of rags to riches, Dick Whittington type narrative. So we need to be suspicious of big categories like the realist novel. In some ways, texts are always complicated and have different kinds of voices going on in them.